I'd like to show you a fascinating battle from round 7 of the Norway chess tournament. Magnus Carlsen playing white against Alireza Firouzja. Now, until this game, going into this 7th round game, Carlsen had not won any of his classical games. He'd drawn them all and had one loss. He's done pretty well in Armageddons, but for Carlsen, that's not a good performance. Let's see what he could do against Firouzja. So pretty normal start, and well, Carlsen could go into an open Sicilian, but instead he played bishop d3. Now that is unusual. That's been seen in some online games, but it's a very rare visitor, certainly at the top level of classical chess. Yeah, Grischuk, for example, has played this online with reasonable results, actually. Well, what's the point? Well, sometimes the bishop can drop back after c3 to c2, and then you go d4. Well, that's certainly not bad. And of course, white is able to castle quickly, but it does look very strange when you block the d-pawn like this. So knight c6 and castles. And now a very straightforward way of playing for black would be d5. But then we can see that this has a point. Now the bishop pins and you go d4. Now this is very like some French defense positions, Tarrasch variation. But here the knight is on b1 and can come to c3 to attack this pawn. So, I mean, I think black is fine here, but white's position isn't without a little bit of poison. So that's one of the ideas. And yes, if black plays something like g6, then, as mentioned before, c3 and bishop c2 followed by d4. Well, that's a very nice position for white, actually. But Firouzja wanted to really upset Carlsen, and he did so with g5. That's a pretty extraordinary move. But with the bishop on d3 and white having to develop very slowly, then actually g5 is not a bad idea. So it's about gaining space on the king side, but also gaining more control over these squares. Reminds me of a line in another anti-Sicilian line. Let me just quick compare and contrast. And this is a line that I recommended in my anti-Sicilians course for Chessable. So bishop b5, this is quite a popular line, but knight d4 is a good answer. Plonking the knight in on the outpost. You see the knight on c3 means that white can't boot the knight away with a pawn. And a6, and the bishop goes back to d3. Right, now you can see the similarities. Knight comes back to c6 before it's exchanged off. And after rook e1, there's a beautiful move, g5. In this position, it's even more effective than in the Carlsen-Firouzja game, because g4 actually threatens to win the knight. And this is a very promising position for black. So, for example, like this, and h5. I mean, white is in a complete gum. This bishop on d3 just gets in the way. And yeah, it's a very, very promising position. So for example, like this, you can see that black has excellent control in the middle and can even launch an attack on the king side as well. These bishops are absolutely wonderful. So coming back to this position, well, if we compare, g4 doesn't actually win a piece because the knight is able to go back to e1. Nevertheless, it's not a beautiful square for the knight. And yeah, I mean, that's common to both positions, that the bishop is on d3 and prevents white breaking in the middle to challenge a wing move like g5. So bishop b5, I think, is a good move from Carlsen now. So he potentially prepares to open with d4, but in any case, well, one of these moves. I was surprised that Firouzja didn't play g4 now, actually. That feels like the best way to go to put the knight back on not such a good square, but instead, well, he played bishop g7. Carlsen exchanged on c6. Now that's very important. he's managed to damage black's structure, and this pawn is now weaker. It can be defended, but as we'll see, that defense can be undermined sometimes with e5. d3. So Carlsen likes this pawn structure, and particularly when he sees a pawn on c5 that he can perhaps attack. So now g4, but somehow the knight isn't as badly placed on d2 as it is on e1. h5, so Firouzja has gained some space, so the king's a little bit cramped. Knight b3, there we go. This knight can spin round to a very good square. It's not just that it looks at c5, but sometimes the a5 square as well. And Carlsen plays f4. Now, of course, black doesn't want to take here because that opens the f-file. It looks like a fantastic king's gambit. So why is Carlsen playing f4? Well, sometimes you could attack with f5, but actually it's more about getting in e5 to undermine the support for this pawn on c5. There are certain similarities with the Nimzo-Indian defense with colours reversed, but also this is quite a common idea in the Grand Prix attack as well, and there are big similarities between these positions. So actually it looks like I think Carlsen would have been very happy with the outcome of the opening. Knight e7, and now Carlsen is in a hurry. He develops very quickly with bishop d2, and that involves a pawn sacrifice. You could play slowly here. You could just play knight d2, and if black castles, then queen e1 with the idea knight c4. You know, you want to tempt this move d5, and who knows, that queen might be able to come out to h4 at some moment. But Carlsen's in a hurry. So perhaps bishop a5 could be upsetting for black. But also, if you can get in bishop c3 to exchange off that bishop, that weakens the king and strategically looks very nice for white. So Firouzja accepted the pawn sack. Bishop a5, that just moves the queen to a not such a nice square. And now knight d2. So it's not just a pawn sack, it's an exchange sack. Well, what happens if black snatches the rook? Well, this is fantastic for white. The queen is on a beautiful diagonal. Without that dark squared bishop, black's position just collapses. Let me show you how. For example, rook h7, now e5, and that knight can come into e4 and then to f6 or potentially c4 as well. And of course, if d5, well, this is very unfortunate. Have a look at black's queen, trapped. So taking on a1 would actually be a complete disaster for black. But you can see, just in taking this pawn and coming back again, which the bishop really needs to do because e5 is coming, that has taken 2 moves. So white has really speeded up development. If you look back to this position a couple of moves ago, well, you can see that black's development is looking fine. White's development is pretty backward. But just in the space of a couple of moves, there's been a transformation, and it's white's move here as well. Queen e1. Yep, it's a nice move. It might spin out to h4. It might support the push to e5. Bishop a6. And I think e5 blows the position open, and that's just very unclear. But Carlsen went for rook d1. It's a very clever move, actually, because would you believe it, that d-file might well open soon. Now, if black castles, then e5. I think this is tremendous for white. So if knight f5, knight e4, you can see that white is getting control over these squares. I mean, this is classic dark square strategy. Beautiful position for white. So that's why Firouzja played f5. It means that after e5, this square isn't available to the knight. So it's kind of, well, provoking Carlsen into playing e5, but at least this square is under control. And yeah, we can see the problem with these pawns, that this pawn is going to be removed one way or another, and then the c5 pawn is hanging. So strategically, very nice position for white. Knight g6. Trying to activate a little bit. Knight c4. So the knight wants to come in here, and that gets exchanged off, and now we can see why Carlsen puts the rook on d1. Very nice. So there's pressure here. Nice pin. So d5 is just about forced, and Carlsen takes back his pawn, and what beautiful pieces they are. Queen c8. Now it drops the knight back to b3. Well, we'll see the point for this next move. I think Firouzja should probably play bishop f8 here. Although, I mean, I still really like white's position after bishop b4, but this is certainly better than the game, because after castles, bishop b4, that's why the knight came back here. Attacks the rook, and bishop d6. That bishop slams in on d6, and this just looks fantastic for white. This bishop controlling b8, so the rook can't find counterplay here. And it dominates. Whoops, that was a misfire. Dominates these major pieces. What a position. At this point, well, I was expecting Carlsen to wrap things up very quickly. He dominates the position. And c5, look at this. Absolutely beautiful. And these minor pieces doing nothing. And this knight ready to float into that wonderful blockading square on d4. Rook d7. I mean, the only thing that black can do is perhaps try to get some play on the h-file. Knight d4. And this is tricky for black. So one piece has to cover e6. Another piece has to cover c6. But also sometimes it might be possible to sacrifice on f5. Can you imagine a queen maybe on d3 covering the f5 square as well? So black is in trouble. Massive trouble. You know, these pieces just completely passive. Rook b1 taking control of the file. h4, I mean, this is perhaps black's only chance to generate a bit of play over here. Queen d3. Carlsen would love it if the queens were exchanged. In fact, that wins one of these pawns straight away. So the queen had to go to a4 to maintain the protection of the pawn on c6. a3 with the idea rook b4, so a5 forced, but that's a pretty miserable square. And Carlsen plays it very simply, rook f d1. So what he's doing is he's covering that knight again, which allows the queen to come to b3, and once the queens are exchanged, then black is utterly lost. There's more than that, actually. Supposing black tries to go for some counterplay here, then you can take on f5, and just feels like black's position is collapsing there. Yes, don't forget a rook about to join the fray as well. So Firouzja exchanged on g3, and now, for better or for worse, Firouzja has to get some activity. So he sacked a piece for 2 pawns. It really is the only try. So Carlsen just has to be on his toes a little bit, but this is lost. You don't have to exchange queens here. One could play queen e3, but queen b3 looks like the simplest way to go, and Carlsen played this pretty quickly. And in fact, Carlsen was up on the clock. He had a time advantage. Firouzja was running down, so that forces an exchange of queens. Carlsen is a piece up. He's got to just make sure that black's activity is quelled. a4, that pushes the rook away from the third rank. So Firouzja is just hoping to get a bit of play on the h-file. Carlsen was moving fairly quickly here. He played rook f1. It was surprising that he didn't take on c6. That attacks the knight. And if check, king g2, and black doesn't really have a huge amount of activity here. f4, knight d4 is a nice move. That really squashes black's play. Because if f3, this can actually be taken. And the knight is in a terrible position. And suddenly, yeah, well, black's king is in trouble. And that pawn gets pushed. I mean, this is winning for white. I mean, it's pretty simple. So knight c6 looks like a very good move. And it does, you know, force that knight to move on, which is, you know, it keeps the initiative. But Carlsen played rook f1. Knight h3 check here, knight g5, and now he took on c6. Everything's fine. It's winning for white. Knight e4. So Carlsen is a piece up. That pawn on c5 looks like it's going to push down the board. Rook h1 is a good move here. And if that's exchanged here, knight d4, this comes back. In fact, this is absolutely fine for white. You know, this is just chugging down the board. This knight controls important squares here. Winning. Or if f4, then this is a nice move, knight e7 check. Just clears the path for the pawn, because after this, c6 and the combination of rook b7 or rook b8 and this rook here. In fact, I mean, this looks a little bit scary, but actually it's completely winning for white. After, for example, here. Okay, this looks a little bit worrying, but actually rook h2 is a really nice move. And that just stops the pawns, and then the pawn goes through. So it involves a little bit of calculation, but exchanging off that active rook certainly looks good. But Carlsen kind of panicked. I think he imagined that almost anything was winning here. And he thought, that knight is the danger piece, I'm going to exchange it off. But black is now back in the game. Rook h3. c6 and king f7, and that allows the second rook into the game. Even though the pawn is on c7, in fact, black is fine. And I suspect Carlsen wasn't really calculating. I think he just assumed that this must be winning for white. But there is no win. At least not for white. So counterplay. Rook takes c2, and of course the rook can defend along c5 as well. Here Carlsen should play rook h1, and this should end in a draw, for example. Okay, like this, and then actually draw by perpetual. But Carlsen played knight e8. He was still playing for a win. Well, that's typical Carlsen. He pushes things to the absolute extreme. Took on e6, and to be fair to him, this does look very dangerous for black. But in fact, black should be winning here. This is the game continuation. They were playing on the increment by now. Both players going right down to the wire. King g3, and here is where Firouzja took a draw. The king can't advance here because f2 and f1. They repeated the position, and that's that. But here black has a win. How do you win? I'll have a quick slurp of tea. You have a little think. It is black to play and win. It's a very nice move. Well, f2 is quite an obvious move. And if the king comes back, then g3. And here. I mean, that's pretty mechanical. That's pretty easy to see. But I suspect that in his haste, Firouzja overlooked this. c8 queen. And now if rook takes, king takes f2, well, the game is still alive. But instead of that, black can play f1 knight, check. If the king goes up, rook h2, and likewise if king f4, then rook f2 is mate. Beautiful finish. So Firouzja missed a win at the end, and instead it ended up in this draw. And so on. Well, I thought there was a fantastic fight, but extraordinary that from this position, with Carlsen a piece up, that he failed to clinch the win. I find that incredible. And Carlsen, well, he is clearly struggling in classical games. They went into an Armageddon game and Carlsen absolutely aced it. He won very quickly, actually. Oh, there was even a little joke, because let me just show you the opening very quickly. The opening was this. Hang on a second. The opening went Carlsen with white again. The opening went like this, and Carlsen played bishop d3, a nice little echo of the classical game, and he won fairly quickly. But if you don't mind, you can look at that yourself. So yes, Carlsen is struggling in the classical games. He's had 6 draws so far and 1 loss, but he has won all 6 of those Armageddon games. So looking at the standings, Carlsen has 9 points. Firouzja, a little bit better. He has 9.5. But out in the lead is Fabiano Caruana with 14.5. He actually, incredibly, well, he played very nice Armageddon game against Gukesh. But Gukesh, wow, he is fast and he is tough, and he hung on and actually won on time at the end. So Caruana kind of tripped up a little bit, but he's still in the lead with 14.5, and Nakamura has 12.5. Realistically, those are the only 2 that can win the tournament with 2 rounds to go. Today, Wednesday, is actually a free day in Norway chess. The final 2 rounds, Thursday and Friday. If you're not a subscriber, click that subscribe button. Let's try and get to 100k. Thanks for watching.